For many years, people got used to seeing the world as one giant marketplace. Everything seemed to flow smoothly across borders. An iPhone could be designed in California, assembled in China, using chips from Taiwan and components from Europe, then sold to a young customer in New York or Berlin with a single tap on a screen. But if you look closely, you can feel the story changing. The container ships are still sailing and trade agreements are still being signed, yet behind them, there is a new mood of doubt, caution, and even fear. More and more countries are quietly raising invisible walls, not only at their borders, but inside their trade, investment, technology, and security policies. There was a time when globalization was told like a modern fairy tale. After the Cold War, it looked as if the world was entering an age of peace and prosperity. Tariffs were cut, supply chains stretched around the planet, and millions of people in Asia, Africa, and Latin America escaped poverty through export-led growth. In the West, consumers enjoyed cheap and abundant goods, affordable holidays, and long-haul flights that became normal parts of life. But like every fairy tale, the opening chapters are always prettier than the later ones. Once people start asking who gained the most and who paid the real price, the story of globalization stops looking like a simple win-win game. It is important to be clear that the world has not switched off globalization in a single night. What we are watching looks more like a slow turning of the wheel. The speed of integration has dropped. Trade in goods no longer explodes like it once did. Flows of investment are more cautious, and more political decisions are taken with the mindset of putting domestic interests first. Economists call this deglobalization, but others prefer softer phrases like reglobalization or fragmented globalization to emphasize that the world is not shrinking, it is being rearranged along new lines. Why then are so many countries, especially the big powers, turning away from the very model of globalization that they once championed? There are at least 4 layers of reasons that overlap one another: economics, politics, security, and social psychology. Each layer matters, but the real impact comes from the way they combine, creating a wave of reaction that stretches from the United States and Europe to China, India, and even many developing economies. First, we have to look at the cost inside each country. Globalization has certainly produced growth, but it has also produced pockets of people and regions left behind. In many industrial towns in the United States, Britain, France, or Germany, steel mills, car plants, and textile factories that were once the heart of the community have been closed or moved overseas. Hundreds of thousands of middle-income workers lost stable jobs, were pushed into low-wage, insecure work, or left the labor market entirely. They watched multinational corporations report record profits and stock markets hit new highs, while their own neighborhoods slid into decline. The distance between Wall Street and the small towns of the Rust Belt is therefore not just a matter of miles, it is a crack in trust. That dissatisfaction has become fuel for a new kind of politics. When traditional parties talk about the benefits of open markets and free trade, many middle-class and working-class voters feel that these promises have nothing to do with their daily lives. They hear statistics about rising GDP, but what they see is a factory gate permanently shut, a small shop bankrupt, and their children leaving town because opportunity is elsewhere. Slogans like "bringing jobs back" or "our country first" start to sound attractive because they offer to return a sense of control people feel they have lost in a globalized world. It is no accident that many of the big referendums and elections of the past decade have been tied to questions about globalization. Brexit in the United Kingdom was not only a decision about membership in the European Union, it was also a backlash against the feeling that distant bureaucrats in Brussels were imposing rules on ordinary people. In the United States and across Europe, Populist movements on both the right and the left have used fears about outsourced jobs, migration, and trade deals that voters never approved directly. Politics has therefore returned to the language of borders, sovereignty, and the idea that the state must shield citizens from the shocks of a global market. The second reason why countries are turning away from globalization lies in the real-world shocks that have exposed the system's weaknesses. The financial crisis of 2008 showed that a housing bubble in one part of the United States could trigger a chain reaction across the whole global banking system. More recently, the COVID pandemic revealed how fragile long supply chains can be when they rely heavily on a few central production hubs. When factories in China and Southeast Asia shut down, the world realized that everything from masks and ventilators to semiconductors could be disrupted at once. A single ship stuck in the Suez Canal was enough to slow global trade and send shipping costs and prices soaring. After these shocks, the key question is no longer how to minimize costs, but how to reduce risks. Government and companies now speak more about diversification, about bringing parts of production closer to home or moving them to countries seen as stable and friendly. New terms like reshoring, nearshoring, and friendshoring appear again and again in economic reports. Supply chains do not disappear, but they become shorter, more regional, and more carefully filtered for political and security reliability. This brings us to the third and extremely important layer, geopolitics. The age when people believed that free trade would make war unthinkable is fading. Strategic rivalry between the United States and China, the war in Ukraine, rising tension around Taiwan, and battles over technology and energy have turned trade into a tool of power. Tariffs are no longer just about revenue, they are bargaining chips. Financial sanctions, controls on chip exports, technology bans, and corporate boycotts are used as weapons in a new kind of confrontation where economic borders and security borders overlap. In this environment, many countries worry that heavy dependence on a few suppliers is an unacceptable security risk. If a rival controls a large part of the supply of chips, rare earth minerals, energy, or critical medicines, then a single political decision could plunge your economy into shortage. That is why Western countries are building huge funds to support chip production at home, moving manufacturing out of China and favoring cooperation with allies. At the same time, China is pushing hard for self-reliance in key technologies and reducing its own dependence on Western components. The result is that trade still flows, but it is increasingly divided into clusters of friends and rivals instead of one deeply interwoven web. As tensions rise, tariffs and trade wars have returned as the most visible symbol of a turn away from globalization. New rounds of tariffs, especially from Washington in recent years, have targeted goods from China, Europe, Mexico, and Canada. International organizations constantly revise global growth forecasts downward and warn about the dangers of trade fragmentation. They also point out that the spectacular reduction in poverty in many developing nations could be reversed if investment and trade flows keep slowing down under the weight of new barriers. The fourth reason is quieter, but deeply transformative: the change in technology. The earlier phase of globalization depended heavily on differences in labor costs. Production and assembly jobs were moved to places where wages were low and workers were many. Now automation, robotics, and artificial intelligence are gradually eroding that advantage. A highly automated plant in the United States, Germany, or Japan can compete on cost with a labor-intensive factory elsewhere, especially once transport disruptions and political risks are taken into account. That encourages governments to believe they can bring some production home without paying too high a price, while offering new skilled jobs to their own workers. Yet technology also creates another paradox. The same digital advances have opened a new form of globalization that is less visible but equally powerful: the globalization of services and data. Even as trade in goods slows, cross-border services like software, design, finance, online education, and digital content continue to grow fast. In many cases, the value of trade in services is helping to offset the weakness in trade in goods, preventing a complete reversal of globalization and reshaping it into a more intangible form. A fifth reason is tied to a challenge that ignores borders, climate change, and sustainability. Many countries, especially in Europe, are introducing carbon taxes, strict environmental standards, and requirements that supply chains become greener. In principle, these are necessary steps to reduce emissions. In practice, the line between climate protection and protection of domestic industry is often blurry. Exporters in the developing world see these rules as new obstacles that make their goods less competitive in rich markets. On the other side, Western politicians can easily use the language of environmental responsibility to justify limits on imports and generous subsidy for domestic producers. Running alongside economic and security fears is another layer of reasons that is more emotional and cultural. Globalization brings people closer together, but it also leaves many communities feeling uprooted. When food, movies, clothing, and online platforms all share a similar global style, there is a deep worrying that languages, cultures, and traditions will be diluted. Large migration flows into Europe and North America have triggered fierce debates over national identity, religion, and ways of life. In this context, the call to take back control of borders is not only about security. It is also a way of reassuring people that their community still has the power to decide who comes in and what rules they must follow. Social media and the digital environment have amplified these feelings. Instead of hearing experts discuss long-term benefits of globalization, people are constantly exposed to dramatic images. A factory gate being locked, migrant boats at sea, clashes in city streets, protests against trade deals. Complex stories are squeezed into short slogans that spread easily and ignite emotions. In a world like this, defending globalization becomes a much harder political task than promising to put up a few barriers, add some tariffs, or walk away from a trade agreement that most voters have never read. But if we go back to the original question, are countries really turning their backs on globalization completely? Reality is far more complicated than a simple yes or no. In absolute terms, global trade remains close to record highs. Many regions are still signing new trade agreements, from Africa to Asia and the Pacific. Supply chains are not being demolished, they are being redesigned. From global to regional, from purely low cost to more resilient, from highly concentrated to more diversified. The world is drifting away from a flat network toward clusters and blocks where trade is still energetic, but increasingly shaped by new political borders. Some researchers describe this as reglobalization or selective globalization. The idea is that states do not abandon the gains from cross-border trade and investment. They simply accept those risks only with partners they trust at a strategic level. This change brings a feeling of greater safety but also raises costs and reduces efficiency. If the world splits into competing trade blocs, long-term growth may slow, innovation may spread less easily, and small economies that rely heavily on exports are likely to suffer the most. For developing countries, this is a particularly painful challenge. They were among the biggest winners of the first wave of globalization. Factories, jobs, foreign investments, and access to rich markets transformed their prospects. Now, if supply chains are pulled back to large consumer markets, if new barriers in tariffs, technology, and environment keep rising, these countries risk being pushed to the margins. International organizations warn that trade fragmentation could sharply cut incomes in emerging economies, while rich nations would lose only a small fraction of their growth. In other words, the world might become a little less unequal inside some countries, but more unequal between countries. For Western societies, the issue is not just defending jobs. It is choosing a model of life. Globalization came with a promise. If you open up, accept competition, and integrate with the world, then your society will become richer, more peaceful, and more connected. Today, average citizens in the United States or Europe are forced to weigh that promise again. They want cheap goods, but they also want local factories to stay open. They want secure energy supplies, but also a green transition. They want to stand up for human rights and the rule of law, but they also do not want to sacrifice every economic benefit from difficult partners. Every step away from the old form of globalization comes with trade-offs, and there are no easy answers. At the individual level, we all feel caught between two forces. On one side, everyday life has never been more global. You eat food from different continents, watch series from Korea, films from America, and news from Europe. You buy products from China and chat with friends on the other side of the world with a few taps. On the other side, the political and economic environment around you is tightening. There is constant talk about buying domestic first, protecting local jobs, keeping data inside national borders. For individuals, globalization is accelerating in the digital sphere, while at the level of states it is slowing, splitting, and being questioned. In the end, the question, why are many countries turning away from globalization, probably needs to be reframed. The real issue is which version of globalization they are rejecting. The version that treated the world purely as a market where everything was measured by the lowest cost and the highest profit has clearly lost its appeal. In its place, states are searching for a new kind of globalization where security, identity, social justice, and the environment sit on the table alongside growth. The difficulty is that no one yet knows how to design such a system without damaging what the world has achieved in the past 30 years. So when you hear about a new round of tariffs, a factory being brought home, a trade agreement stalled, or a politician promising to take back control, remember that these are not just technical moves. They are signs of a deeper negotiation that humanity is conducting with its own model of globalization. That negotiation will decide not only how fast goods move from port to port, but also whether the world of the future looks like an open network that accepts some risks, or a map of economic fortresses facing each other across new walls. And perhaps the most important question for each of us is not only whether states are turning away from globalization, but what we are personally willing to trade in order to feel safer and more fairly treated in a world that will remain intensely connected. The answer will be different in Washington, Berlin, Paris, Beijing, or New Delhi. Yet taken together, those answers will shape the next chapter of globalization in this century.